do what you want to do, and then have the work ethic to get really good at it.
Freedom is not free. Discover what it takes. It's time to tap and move forward.
Hello and welcome to Tap and Move Forward. I'm your host, Lynn Shelley. This is an interview I have wanted for a while. Jeff Kirkham is a bit of a local celebrity, and he is one of the most accomplished people I have met. He has almost 29 years as a Green Beret, multiple deployments, tons of real-world combat experience. He's written many books, studied 7 different languages, has multiple patents, including one for a tourniquet he invented. He also co-founded Black Rifle Coffee and Readyman. And in the interview, I got to dive into his mindset and his experience and discover the foundation for his success. Now the interview with Jeff Kirkham. Jeff Kirkham, this has been an interview that I've been excited about for a long time, and I just found out recently you have way more military experience than I even anticipated. I have definitely known of you for a long time, and I'm really excited to get to know more about your early beginnings in the military.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why did you join the military, and how old were you?
That's a tricky question. So I joined when I was 17. So I was what was called a split option trainer. So I joined when I was a junior in high school, and then I went to basic training and jump school. Back in those days, it was easier to manipulate stuff. The recruiter, was easier for him to manipulate schools. And so I went to jump school and basic training between my junior and senior year of high school.
Wow.
And then I came back. I was about a week or 10 days behind, late for the school year because I was at jump school. So I came back and then just kicked off and started going in that, and then finished out my senior year of high school, and then had about 1 week for a summer break, and then boom, went to infantry school, 11 Bravo, and then straight to the Special Forces Q course.
That's crazy. I didn't even know that I didn't know that was a possibility for anyone to do that.
I don't know if it still is, but back then it was called a split option trainer. And then being able to go straight into Special Forces, now they call that the 18 X-ray program. But back then, the only people that could do that, I started off in 19 Special Forces Group. And back then, the only people that could do that were reserve guard components could go straight in, and they called it a Rep 63. Now it's essentially an 18 X-ray. But yeah, that still exists. I don't know if the split option trainer thing still exists. I assume that it does, because they get a huge number of soldiers that way, soldiers, sailors, and Marines. I don't know if the other services, but the Army does.
So were you an athlete in high school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I played football and I wrestled. So I played football and I wrestled, and then I would wrestle in the off season doing freestyle. And then when I was about 16 years old, I started fighting amateurly. So kickboxing was just starting to hit the scene, not Thai boxing. Thai boxing was a few years after that. So I started doing kickboxing. So it was full contact, karate essentially. And then that evolved into Muay Thai, Thai boxing. And then eventually I got introduced to jiu-jitsu. And then that evolved into jiu-jitsu and MMA.
Wow. So you were a really dynamic athlete already when you joined the military.
I guess, yeah.
Was it an easy transition for you in the military?
Yeah, that's, for me, there's only 2 things I ever wanted to be in my life. When I was a little kid, if you'd have talked to me probably pre-5th grade, I would have said I wanted to be a mountain man. Because I'd seen the movie with Charlton Heston, and it was called The Mountain Men, and I'd seen Jeremiah Johnson with Robert Redford, and I was like, that's it, that's what I wanted. I'm going to be a mountain man, and to my mother's chagrin, she was like, oh, I don't know about that for a job.
He found a way to integrate it for sure.
And then let's see, so I was about 5th grade or something. I met a guy. He was a retired sergeant major. Or no, he wasn't retired. He was a sergeant major, and he had been a Green Beret in Vietnam. And so that was, for me, I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. I want to be a Green Beret. I had no idea what even that meant or what it was, other than this one guy was really cool. And so I wanted to be, I was like, well, that must be really cool if there's guys like them in there. And so, like, from, about sixth grade on, that's all I ever wanted to do. So when I joined 19th group, it was like, whoa, I can go straight to special forces from here. Perfect. That's what sign me up.
Did they have any specific parameters that you had to live up to get that position?
You did. So you've got you had to score a 110 on the GT test. So when you take the ASVAB, when their general technical skills, which they've got some weird formula, don't ask me what that is, but they've got some weird formula that they figure out. You've got all these different scores in your ASVAB, and GT is one of them. So you have to have at least a 110 GT score to go to Special Forces school. And then you have to be able to pass the PT test to a certain extent. And that's basically it. It's a Special Forces. They're looking for, they can teach you all of the skills that you need, but what they can't teach you is the raw materials. So you got to show up with enough of the raw materials. So enough of the innate intelligence that you can learn the stuff that they're going to teach you, as well as a physical fitness level to, whatever that X amount was. And it's not a huge physical fitness level. I mean, it's like, you've just got to be good enough. They're not looking, and this is a very common misconception about special operations. They're not looking for the strongest, the fittest, the fastest, the most accurate. You can teach people all of that stuff. What they're looking for is people who won't quit and can get along with others and will work in a team. If you catch that dynamic, they're just smart enough, they're smart enough to, do X, Y, and Z, and they're fit enough that they can fulfill. But where they really selection, when you go to selection for any of these, the SEALs are the same, the PJs are the same, the combat controllers are the same, Special Forces, no different. Ranger battalions, no different. Where they go in and they're going to go, okay, who's going to quit? So get rid of them right off the top, because you don't want a bunch of quitters in there. And then who can get along with people, who can work in a team dynamic, because in special operations particularly, but I argue like in the United States military, the thing that sets us apart from all of the other militaries in the world is we work as cohesive units. And so the example I like to tell people is like the Roman Empire didn't take over the entire known world because they had exceptional warriors. And I don't like that term warrior, because we're not warriors. We're soldiers, sailors, and Marines. And soldiers, sailors, and Marines and airmen work as cohesive units. And because we work as cohesive units, there's no ego when I get on the phone or the radio to talk to the pilot who's going to come in and drop close air support, or I'm talking to the helicopter guys that are coming in for resupply or medevac, and there's no ego on their side. They're like, yep, no problem, that's my job, that's what I'm going in to do. That's somewhat unusual in the rest of the world, where they get some back and forth. I mean, really, like if you look at probably the most glowing example of that is or glaring example of that would be the Russians when they went into Chechnya the first time. Because the Russians don't fight, at least back then. They've cleaned up their act since then, but they were not fighting as cohesive units. So the army wasn't talking to their pilots, and nobody had commo between the two, and they're running off of different frequencies. And there's and this guy was mad at that guy, and they weren't getting supplied, and so the first time they went into Chechnya, they got their butts kicked because it was just chaos. And then they step back and they're like, okay, maybe we need to fix that a little bit. And so the U.S., we definitely lead the world in that. And so in special operations is that to the nth degree of like, how do we facilitate and use all of this stuff so that we can be maximally effective? So
I really love that you bring that up, just because recently I had a woman that was telling me that she thought that there was too much battling between the branches. And I told her there's a lot of friendly rivalry that happens between the branches. There's plenty of that, but it's more like siblings. And when it comes down to it in the fight, we're all fighting together.
We're all fighting together.
Yeah.
And I would argue too, is like at the end of the day, that ego just ends up sacrificing their own people. And so for me, when I was a team sergeant, and maybe I was a bit of the extreme, like first day one when I came in, and a team sergeant he's the head NCO on a special forces team. We had an officer, but the NCO is the one that's running the team. And so when I was running the team, day one, I showed up and and we were just a regular rucksack team. And I was like, okay, day one, if you guys have any schools that you want to go to, put your name in on it and I will sign it, and off you go. Go to Halo School or Scuba School or any of these other schools. And I had a bunch of people that came to me and they're like, you're going to lose your team because all your guys are going to leave. And I was like, they're not going to leave. It's like, because I'll continue to support them, and they'll go and they'll gravitate towards the people and the leaders that will end up supporting them. And so that's very true. And so actually at one point they wanted to give me a waiver because there were so many people trying to come to my team, and I didn't lose any of those guys that I told them they could go to schools. And so with that, I think, there's these friendly rivalries between like Ranger Battalion and Special Forces, and Ranger Battalion's predominantly younger guys and Special Forces guys are a little bit older guys. And so there's this rivalry between Ranger Battalion and Special Forces. And there's a lot of guys that were in battalion that then went to group over in Special Forces. And but there's a lot of, in Ranger Battalion, there's a lot of guys saying, don't go to those guys, they're old fat guys, and they're not as hardcore as Ranger Battalion. But I think in the end they end up doing themselves a disservice, because Ranger Battalion has a tendency to grind through people. It's a very, like, Ranger Battalion is like dog years it's like 1 year in battalion is like 5 years anywhere else, and they just churn through people. And so I think they end up doing themselves a disservice. I think the Marines are kind of the same way.
Yes,
the Marines hate special operations. They hate special operations. I was just talking to a gal that it was in Marine special operations, and she hated that Marines had MARSOC. And I was like, well, it's proven. And she's like, all Marines are special operations. And I'm like, oh, that old story. Okay, well, and I was like, well, but I think you end up doing a disservice to, you have those people that want to gravitate and are better at it, and they love it. And you can't say that everybody that goes through basic training is that way. It's a fallacy. It's not true.
Right. I think it's really important that you're bringing up a lot of leadership tactics and skills in there, which is something that I was going to ask you about later. But it sounds like supporting your people was something very important to you as a leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, you've got to support your people. You're always looking out for the best for your folks, because if you're not, then everything starts falling apart, and sometimes stuff falls apart anyways. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, I did everything that I could and it just didn't work, or I did everything I could and we still got wounded, but I did everything that was possible within my power, within my sphere of influence that, is out here at about my fingertips, and that's it, was able to do whatever I could. And that's like, with having been in combat and now in business, I mean, that's kind of the motto, is like, I take it very personally, the people that, that I'm looking out for, to make sure that they're taken care of, even to the detriment of, of myself and hours or pay or whatever, accolades, take your pick.
Really, though, it makes it so easy to follow someone like that. And I've seen throughout my career, the leaders that are most impactful, or that I follow most with wholeheartedly, I guess, are the ones that I know take my best interest into account when they're making decisions.
Well, it doesn't take very long to figure out, like, we've all had commanders that were in it for themselves, and and it was like everything that they could do was so that they could look better. And whether that was, way too much restraint because they were risk averse, or all the way over to like way overzealous and way over aggressive and just trying to get those numbers on missions. I've got to be able to surpass the last guy's number of missions, regardless of, risking people's lives. So it's like there's this balance somewhere in the middle. And I think with that is, if looking out for your people's welfare is the number one thing. Like me, we predominantly worked, when I was in the counter-terrorist unit, we worked with small numbers of Americans, so there'd be 3 or 4 of us, and we would have 100 to 300 Afghans that we were conducting operations with. So like similar, these guys that you just met back there that have come over here on special immigrant visas. And so, and with that, like I got along with the Indige very well. I was actually known as somebody that did a great job with them, because in the Indige, the host nation guys, our commandos, would always follow me because they knew that I would never ask them to do something I wasn't willing to do myself. They knew that I would always look out for their welfare. They knew that, I would stand up and go, no, we're not doing that, because I'm not risking these men's lives over something like that. And that's sometimes a hard thing to find in some of the other advisory units. Not ours, but it was kind of hard to find in some of the advisory units, because it's very easy to go, that's the Afghans. Just send them in, and away they'll go, or the Iraqis, and we'll just send them in. And I just never approached it that way, and so consequently, I could get way more work and way more effectiveness out of my guys because they knew I was watching out for them. Like if they came to me, like I had a policy with the Afghans, it's like, you got to learn a little bit about their culture. And they're like, sir, I need a few days off because I'm going to get married. And it's like, well, why didn't you tell me? And they'd go, well, I just found out myself, and as an American, you're like, that's BS, bull crap. That's not true. You must have known for months. Why didn't you tell us? But if you dig a little bit into their culture, it's actually not that unusual that their dad is like, hey, you're getting married next weekend or 2 weekends from now. And the dude's like, I am? And it's like, yeah, you are. So Get ready. And so like all of a sudden these guys would, take off to get married. And so for me, I never doubted their stuff, because they would kind of police themselves a little bit too. But somebody would get sick, or somebody would die, or somebody had problems at home or something. And I always was like, take care of your family. It's like your family always comes first. Take care of your family. Go do that. And so consequently, I earned a lot of those guys' trust. Undoubtedly, there were people that abused it and, took advantage of the situation. But the majority took that to heart, and then they were the ones that would end up policing the other guys and saying, hey, you're taking advantage of this, come on.
How would you deal with that situation?
With what? If they're
you knew
taking
someone
advantage?
was taking advantage, yeah.
What I would do is I would push it down to my, because for us, our program was very unusual in that we clothed, fed, took care of, paid, promoted, fired our force. So our force that we had was not, regular Afghan military that got pressed upon us. They were our guys. We recruited them. We trained them. We led them. We advised them. And so, and as the unit matured, when we'd have problems like that, I would ask the commander to come and tell me, and I would be like, well, what do you think we should do? And they give, 2 or 3 options, because that's what we train them to do. It's like, if we ask you these questions, give us 2 or 3 options. And then I'd kind of direct it. It doesn't do any good if I'm the one making all of the decisions, because then I'm never developing a subordinate leader, because ultimately we don't want Americans there. Ultimately, we want to turn this over to the Afghans that are allies, or the Iraqis that are allies, and away they go, and that's kind of a far-fetched dream, but that's the goal. That's what we're trying to do. And if we never empower our subordinate leaders, we're never going to get there, because they're constantly going to be coming to us asking for, questions and answers and solutions. And it's like, no, you guys are really smart. So what would you do? And they'd come up with stuff, and I'd be like, okay, that sounds good to me. And then they would do it, and we didn't have to worry about it on our side.
Nice. So before we get too far down the road as far as what happened later in your career, I want to go back to the beginning. Did you ever consider any other highly tactical careers in the military?
No.
No? You knew what you wanted. There was no time to even look at other options.
No. I mean, I was, after I'd been in group, after I'd been in special forces in the 90s, so I got out. So I was active duty all through the 90s, and then I got out, and I was, and I went back to the Guard and Guard Special Forces in 19th Group. And it was one of those moments where it's like, well, should I try something different? And I looked at the PJs, I looked at combat controllers, I looked at the SEALs, even.
Nice.
And, and I actually was going through the process to become a SEAL. And the recruiting process, I didn't join the Navy. And I was like, well, the SEALs, that looks like that's cool. I was already a combat diver in Special Forces. And so I was like, maybe I'll check out being a SEAL. Diving's kind of cool. And so I started going through the process. But at that time, there were big cutbacks that were happening. And so it was really hard to get your contract guaranteed. And because what I wanted was, I wanted another school. In the Navy, they call them A schools. I wanted another A school and then go to BUDS. And they couldn't do that. So they could only bring me on as a bosun's mate. And I had already received a bunch of training and medical stuff. Like I first got certified as an EMT when that was 1987. I think I was 17. I think I did that the year that I joined, and then maintained my EMT. And so they, the plan was I was going to go in as an intelligence guy, and then go to BUDS. So I'd go to the Intelligence A School, then I'd go to BUDS. And then at the final phase of BUDS, they're going to do the Dominus Ominus, you're a corpsman, because I already had a slew of medical training for handling trauma and stuff. And I was like, okay, that's great. Send me the paperwork. So I get the paperwork, and it says that I'm going in as a bosun's mate. And if you don't know what a bosun's mate is, they are the jack of all trades on a boat or a ship. Sorry, Navy guys out there, but on a ship, which means it's everything from scraping paint to offloading cargo to doing whatever. And I was like, hey, man, no, I'm not going to, because the problem that you run into is like in any of these courses, it's like I had no worries about passing, but there's also an element of luck. Like if you sprain an ankle, you twist a knee, you break a leg, which happens in the selection process, you're screwed. And I was like, well, wait a minute. If I get injured throughout this process, and I'd already had some issues with my back that I later found out I had broken it. But if I was like, man, if I had some issues that are from this, then I'm going to be a bosun's mate scraping paint on some ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, and I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so, because they couldn't give me the intelligence slot. And so I was like, well, all right, better luck next time. But then consequently, I became a deputy for about a year, and then I got hired and I was a special agent with DEA, which was fantastic.
Really cool. So at that beginning, back to the beginning of your career, when you first joined and you went through basic and your preliminary schools, did you find anything that was really surprising to you about the military, or did you just take to it like a fish like water?
No, I just took to it because my dad was in the Air Force. And so I grew up around military folks my entire time. My dad did 27 years in the Air Force. And it was just, stepping off the bus and getting yelled at by a drill sergeant and cleaning toilets with a toothbrush. And I was like, yeah, this is, yep. That's what I was expecting, and I had been a Boy Scout too. So all of the field skills, I was like, well, it's just like being in the Boy Scouts. It's like, here's your compass, here's your map. And I was like, oh yeah, I know how to do this. You get the refresher training from the guys, and then boom, off you'd go. And so I was a pig, and as we call a pig and poop, that's happy because it was like, yeah, this is awesome. They're paying me to go out and do orienteering and shoot guns and jump out of airplanes. And once in a while, some guy yells at me. That's okay. I can handle that. And away you go. So no, I never. That was it. That's all I ever wanted to do was be a Green Beret.
It sounds like your life was kind of preparatory for you to join. Is there anything you specifically did to prepare?
Yeah, martial arts, that was a biggie. Boy Scouts, that was another biggie. I read a lot about history, and military history specifically. And then consequently later on, I found out at least the guys that I was around, and I've seen this true since, like in special forces, like they're the most voracious readers that I've ever been around, where guys would just consume books at a a mega level, where like it was not unusual that there would be 3 or 4 footlockers full of books of all kinds of different degrees. And then when we deploy, guys, you just burn through books and read them. And it was everything from sci-fi to tactics to history, a lot of history that was in there, to college textbooks and stuff where you'd go through and read that stuff. So I would say my love for reading was a big preparation. I would say that the physical fitness, the martial arts was certainly a part, not necessarily because they're teaching you karate or anything. They do now, but back then they didn't. But it was the proprioception of where your body's at in relation to, where you're standing and whatnot. That definitely helped. It helped a lot when I went to free fall school and stuff. And, and wrestling, it helped a lot, just that not quitting and keep chugging through no matter how bad it sucks. And you wrestlers that are out there will understand that. So, but yeah, everything for me, my world was like, okay, this is what I want to do. In a lot of ways too, that probably kept me out of trouble, because I was always one of those kids that I was right on the edge of like, yeah, let's break into that building because that would be cool. That's what commandos and spies do. But it was always in the back of my head where my dad was like, if you get arrested for doing something stupid, then it will go on your clearance and you'll never get a security clearance and you'll never be able to be a Green Beret. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to break in, I'm not going to do that thrill of breaking into a building or doing something stupid or smoking pot or, any of the other drugs. When I was a kid, it was like there weren't really any drugs out there except for like pot and, and some kids would drink beer and stuff. But it was, for me, I always titrated, like, it was like, okay, booze, if I get in trouble drinking booze, that's going to go on my record. That's going to affect my security clearance. So I don't want to, so I got to make sure that I'm really careful. Never smoked marijuana or anything. So, it kept that clean. So it was definitely a biggie for me, staying focused, because that's where I wanted to go.
You were so clear on that long-term goal that those short-term decisions became easier to make.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had a purpose,
right?
Which goes into, a lot of veterans now, they get out of the military and they lose their purpose. And if you think about it, the military it's constant improvement. You're constantly being mentored. You're constantly being expected to mentor somebody below you. You're constantly expected to teach and advise the person below you, your subordinates, to take your job, because the person above you is doing the same thing for you as well. And so you get these quarterly counselings where where you're doing good, where you're doing bad, where you can improve. And it's this constant stuff. And then above all of that is the mission of the unit that you're in. So what's our mission? So there's this constant, it's like, this is what we're striving for. This is what we're trying to do. This is where we're going. This is why we're doing all of this stuff, so that we can be better at the mission. And then all of a sudden you get out of the military. And so you've got this massive purpose, right? And then all of a sudden you get out of the military and there's no purpose. And it's like, okay, why am I doing this? To make money. Well, that's not a purpose. It's essentially a result.
Right.
I'm doing something and I'm making money, and the result is I make money. But what is it that you're doing? Why are you doing that? And to find purpose. And I think a lot of vets have a hard time afterwards. And for me, that's what the purpose of going in and being a Green Beret and doing secret stuff, that purpose is what kept me, on the straight and narrow as much as I could. I still did stupid stuff as a teenager, don't get me wrong, but that's what kept me on the straight and narrow.
I have to say that there's a piece of me that's really jealous, just that you were so clear on what you want, what your long-term goal was, because that piece can be really difficult, something you're that committed to. Have you, it sounds like it just came very naturally to you.
I don't know why it happened that way.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I just sunk my claws into that dream, that goal, and that was it. It was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. From the time I was, a little kid, it was it was very clear to me. It was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what that's where I'm going to go, and away I go. I mean, and even to the point, like my mom, when I was joining at 17, your parents have to, one of your parents have to sign off on it. And my mom's this little old lady from the South, and she was like, I'm not signing she's like, I'm not signing a piece of paper where my son can go be a commando. And I was like, whatever, Ma, all I need is Dad's signature. And my dad and my mom were always a united front. So one would never undercut the other. And so my mom was like, no, I'm not signing that paper. And I was like, whatevs, Dad, all I need is one parent's signature. And my dad was like, I can't sign that paper. And I was like, what are you talking about? You're a colonel in the Air Force. You have to sign it. And he was like, if your mother doesn't sign it, then I can't sign it. And he's like, I will talk to your mom. But he was like, unless both of us sign it, I can't do it. And so, and he eventually talked to her and was like, hey, look, he's joining the National Guard. Yes, it's Special Forces, but in about 6 months, he's going to be 18, graduated high school, and then he'll just join active duty, and he'll be gone, and you'll have no say. And she, my mom acquiesced and was like, all right, and she begrudgingly signed the paper, and, the rest is history.
It sounds like, from what you were saying earlier, that you would say that wrestling was a big factor in your no quit attitude.
It was, definitely.
How did wrestling prepare you that way?
Wrestling is a really interesting team sport because it's a very individual sport, but your team, there's still a huge amount of pressure from your team for you to perform because it's only you out on the mat, wrestling against the other person. But those points all go towards your team, and that determines which team wins at a tournament. So you don't have individuals that win tournaments. You had schools that win tournaments. So you could have, individuals would win state and stuff like that, but the tournaments were all done by the tournaments, and like schools would wrestle against other schools. So you could be a fantastic prima donna that, could destroy everybody, but if the rest of your team wasn't any good, you still lost the wrestling match. And so it was very unusual in that it was a very individual sport, but it was also a very team-oriented sport. And so all of a sudden, and there's nowhere to hide when you're out on the mat. So for wrestling, there's a couple of things that take place. You got to make weight. So you're cutting a little bit of weight. They've done a great job of moderating that a little bit now. But back in the 80s, we had kids that were cutting like a ton of weight. And so you had to make weight. And if you didn't make weight, then you lost that slot and you'd lose those points, and your team was disgusted with you. And your team, you're together every day at practice and stuff. So if you're eating Twinkies and ho-ho, you can tell who's cutting weight and who's not cutting weight. And so that was a biggie. So making weight, which is a very individual thing. And then you get out on the mat. Well, it's not like a football team where you can kind of hide and say that, and your football players are probably screaming right now too, but you can't hide. Do you know what I mean? It's just you out on the mat. And it's like, and everybody knows if it's a good match or if it's like a fish match. Everybody knows that if the guy you're wrestling is like, we call them fish, and, where somebody was easy to beat, everybody knows if that was an easy thing, and everybody knows where different wrestlers are ranked. So when you get out there and you're battling it out with somebody else, your team knows that you're putting everything on the line and pushing forward to win and not quitting because you got a bloody nose or something like that. So it's like you're very much in the spotlight. Whereas like you see basketball players, I'll beat up on basketball player, but you see some of these guys will fall down on the ground and they're like, oh, it's broken. It's like, come on, dude, that's not broken. You're fit. It's basketball. Come on. And, and that's where wrestling, and interestingly enough, I've got a good buddy of mine that I was in the CT unit with that he had been a SEAL, and, he said that the Navy did a study because they were trying to figure out like what was the number one determining factor for guys making it through BUDS, basic underwater demolition school or basic underwater demolition SEAL. And, and everybody's heard of buds, and they were trying to figure out is it an intelligence thing? Is it a physical fitness thing? Were they a team captain, or did they have no physical fitness, or, is it just whatever? They're trying to figure this stuff out. With farm kids or kids from the city or kids from good homes or kids from bad homes. And they said that the one thing based off of what he told me, the one determining thing that they could show was if a kid had wrestled in high school, he had a much higher chance of making it through successfully through buds versus somebody who hadn't. And I think a lot of that is because at a very young age, you're learning, you've got a tremendous amount of peer pressure from your team that's looking at you, but when you're out on the mat, it's just you, and there's no hiding.
That's really amazing. Like I had no idea that wrestling was so dynamic, I guess. I mean, yeah, I just had seen tournaments, and one-on-one. I didn't necessarily realize the culture behind it. That makes sense in a lot of ways to prepare, especially on the teamwork side. Mm-hmm. But I didn't necessarily see the correlation with the no quit, other than, your team is going to make sure you don't quit.
Right.
So it's almost like the support to make sure you don't quit.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's constantly encouraging people and checking on them. As a team captain when I was in wrestling, and it's like, hey, where you at on your weight? Are you exercising afterwards? What are you doing to lose weight? What are you doing on your diet? And then it was high school, right? So grades had to be a certain level or they wouldn't let you wrestle. It was like, hey, where are you at on your grades? You're doing a garbage job in science. Let's get together and study so that we can, I'm good at science, you suck at it, so let's get together and work, and tutoring people. So it was more than just like running laps and getting smoked while you're out there doing PT to lose weight so that you could go out and wrestle. But it was making sure that everybody was, doing the academic side as well so that they could wrestle.
Holding everybody on the team to a really high standard.
Holding everybody accountable. Yeah.
No wonder why it was so easy, the transition into the military.
Yeah. In a lot of ways. Yeah.
So if you ever come across somebody who's joining the military, what type of advice do you like to give them?
I tell them, probably first and foremost that somebody that's going into the mill and they're interested in going in the mill, I tell them, okay, what do you want to do? Well, I want to do X, Y, and Z because I can get out and make a lot of money. And I'm like, bad plan. It was like, what do you want to do? And then I tell them, hey, do what you want, because if you want to do that, you find interest in that. Then when some sergeant's yelling at you, making you do push-ups, and you're having a horrible time, and you're surrounded by a bunch of people you don't like, doing a job that you don't like, because you were trying to get out and make money, I was like, that's a bad plan, because there's enough stress. It's like married couples that are in turbulence, and then are like, well, let's have kids, and that will help our marriage. And it's like, that's a horrible plan.
Right.
Because kids, I mean, I love my boys, I love them to death, but they add a level of stress into a relationship that is like, if you don't have a strong relationship before you have kids, you're gonna have a hard time. Well, the military is no different. If you don't have a strong relationship with a job that you're doing or that you want to do, you're gonna have a horrible time. And money is not a strong relationship. Money is a result of you doing a job passionately and doing it well. And you have to do a job well, you need to be passionate about it. And so the piece of advice I give them is, what do you want to do? That's what you should do when you go in the military. If it's driving trucks, if it's water purification, if it's, being a commando, if it's every job is vitally, vitally important. Not everybody, it's like the Navy has a fantastic way of recruiting, because you think everybody in the Navy is either a fighter pilot or a SEAL. There's like nobody in there scraping paint in the Navy, and that's where it's like, hey, you've got to be able to, when you go in and you do that, you've got to get a job that you're going to enjoy, because if you don't, man, you're going to have a horrible time doing that. And so, and then you just count your days, and then you're never very good at your job. and you don't like it, and then all of a sudden you ETS and you get out, and the problem that you run into is now you went into a job that you thought you were going to be able to get out and make a lot of money. You went in, you've gotten a bad taste for that job, because like the military can kill the love of anything that's in there. It's like to this day, it's like, okay, I'll go diving, and I'll go scuba diving, and I've been scuba diving all over the world, but the military just like pounded that crap out of me, because it was just like, that sounds like a lot of work, and I don't know if I want to do that now, but if you love it, you'll keep doing it. And so that's where it's like the plan of joining the military and getting some skill you're going to get out and make a lot of money, not if you have a bad time doing that. So go in, first and foremost, go in and do what you think is going to be interesting, and then you'll be good at it. And then when times suck, you'll be like, whatever, these guys are jerks, but I like what I'm doing.
It's a really good point. And also, I'm glad you're bringing up all of the stress that comes as part of the military package. It's just part of the way that it's structured. It's purposeful, even a lot of times. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's not purposeful, but there's things that are just factors that cause stress. But I love that being a prerequisite of making sure you do something you love, because that's going to help you through your stressful times. What other tactics did you like to use to help with stressful situations, whether you were deployed, away from family, or just the stressors of the job?
For me, one of the, obviously exercise is a biggie. And probably I lasted as long as I did doing the job that I was doing, because I'd figured out how to manage stress. So I racked up just over 8 years on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq. And all of that was in a direct action role. So all of that was assaulting targets. And so, there's very few people that have that much time as in a DA capacity, because it burns you out. It really does. I mean, it'll fry your nerves. It'll fry your emotions. It'll fry you psychologically, because you're red line to idle, red line to idle, red line to idle, just repeatedly. And so the people that can figure out how to manage that for periods of time are the ones that ultimately are successful. So some of the stuff are successful in the long term. There's plenty of guys and gals that do it for the short term and do fantastic jobs, and then they go on and they do something else. For me, like biggies was exercise was one of those. Finding escapes that are around the, for me, like training is a bit of an escape. So like my mornings would start out where I'd grab a rifle. We own the ranges and stuff, so it was easy for me to do stuff like this. But I'd grab a rifle and I'd run out to the back gate, and then I'd come back and I'd stop at the grenade pit and I'd throw a couple of hand grenades. Then I'd go up to the KD range, and I'd built a gym on the KD range. I mean, this is kind of all the rage now, where people are working out and shooting. And I was doing that like back in 2004 when I built this gym. And so I'd shoot and I'd exercise, and I'd shoot and I'd exercise, and it was kind of relaxing. And then I'd, go back, and that was kind of my day. And so that would help titrate a way to kind of decompress. And then also for me, like that's actually is kind of how I got started writing. And so, I wrote the Small Unit Leaders Planning Guide, which is a checklist for mission planning. So it's warning order, op order, FRAGO, coordination checklist, and then I've got the military decision-making process is in there as well. But I was flying on a helicopter one night, and there was this pilot who had been flying since Vietnam. He was like hundreds of hours flying helicopters, and I heard him going through the pilot's checklist. It was like, check this, and then the co-pilot would say checking, and then okay, check this, okay, checking, check this, roger, checking. And so he's going down this checklist. So here's a guy that had been flying literally longer than I'd been alive, going through the checklist one by one by one by one by one by one. And you could argue that it was like, well, this guy has done this a bazillion times, like literally tens of thousands of times. And he still would go through this checklist. And I had this moment where I was like, well, why don't we do that for infantry? I mean, we have the warning, or, we have the operations order format. but it's guidelines. There's no checklist. And so I was like, well, I'm going to make a checklist. And so so that was my first book. But then I found, I figured out, I was like, man, that was kind of therapeutic. And then my brother told me a little later, he said, hey, the guy, and I have no idea if this is true or not, but I like to believe it's true. But he was like, yeah, the guy that wrote the Jack Reaper novels was an MP in Vietnam, and he was in Saigon or something. And so when he would come back at night, you're super wound up, and he would use this as a way to kind of decompress. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. And so I came back to my hooch one night. We'd just come back from an assault, and, and you're super spun up, and because you're like maxed out on caffeine, and plus you're maxed out from, if it was a helicopter assault or a truck assault or something. And so you come back and it's like, okay, it's 3:00 in the morning. I'm not going to go run and it's like, I'm awake, but I'm too tired to go work out in the gym. I just want to sit and chill. And so I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to try writing. So I started writing a sci-fi novel. And it was just word vomit that went out onto the screen, and I was like, okay, and it was about a special forces guy in Afghanistan that runs into zombies, right?
Nice.
And so, and so I started writing, and at one point I stopped, and it was like 2 hours later, and I was like, oh, wow, okay. That was cool, because you get totally lost in this world of your own manufacturing. So I went to bed, slept great, woke up the next day, went on another mission, and came back, and I was like, man, I want to write on my, I'm going to write some more on my book. And so I started hammering some more pages out on the book, and the grammar was horrible, and there's misspellings all over the place, but it didn't matter. It's my book. And so I did this, and I got about 250 pages into it, and worked on it for, throughout my time that I was going back and forth over there. But I found it to be, so cathartic, being able to just get lost in this own world, because I had like giants and zombies and a bunch of stuff on there, magic, and, it was like, hey, there's no rules. This is my world. I can do whatever I want. And that ultimately is what led to one of the things that helped lead to Black Autumn when we wrote that. But that was a biggie. And to this day, I tell a lot of folks that are grappling with PTSD or they are having other issues, I'm like, man, have you thought about writing? It doesn't have to be pretty or anything, but it's quite an escape to be able to just get lost in your own head.
It makes a lot of sense when you're talking about how there's no rules. Like, you could literally add anything because it's your story, it's your world. And to get lost in that kind of place where there's no rules, I can see how that would be really healing when you're normally in a place that has so many rules.
Tons of rules. Yeah.
So many rules.
Yeah.
But those rules are there to help you, to keep you safe and to make sure you come home.
Yep.
So.
And they're hard, and they're hard and fast and important rules, but it's definitely, and that's where you kind of need an escape. I think that's why sometimes people, that's why some folks drink, for a variety of reasons, but they drink because it numbs out a little bit of the, if you've got a brain like mine that's constantly going, and it's like, okay, well, a little bit of alcohol helps slow that down a little bit. So it's like, oh, okay, I can, go to bed or something like that. And I think, and there's obviously, that's a fine edge of like, okay, it's treat it like medicine, because too much of any medicine is bad for you. So don't do that. You got to make sure, but I don't think anybody would say that you can write too much. I guess you probably could, but it's hard to overdose on writing a science fiction novel or something like that. Yeah. I guess if you're in your basement eating Cheetos and all you do is write all day, that's probably too much. But yeah, for decompressing, it's fantastic.
That's awesome. Such a great answer too. I've never heard that. And while we're on the topic, like, you've written a number of books or co-authored a number of books.
We have. So my business partner and my good friend, Jason, we own Readyman together, but we first wrote Black Autumn. So Black Autumn is the main center point novel. And we were sitting around talking one day. So we're big with Readyman. We're, in the emergency preparedness, we got a lot of preppers and survivalists, and we kind of focus on, emergency preparedness, being prepared in case of, whatever, financial problems, like personal financial problems, all the way up to like the dollar collapses. And we can talk about that, or, or tornado or wildfire, or, aliens come from outer space and attack, or, whatever. And so we were sitting around one time, and he was like, how do you think the world could stumble? How do you think that there could be issues? And I was like, well, I think X, Y, and Z. And he's like, oh, that's really interesting. And so we started back and forth, well, if this happened, then what do you think would happen? What do you think the trickle down would be? And so we came up with a bunch of these theories, and that we were just chatting about it. And one of us, I think it was Jason, was like, man, we should write this down. And I was like, yeah, we should. And so I thought about it, and in that science fiction novel that I had been writing in Afghanistan, I pushed that over to Jason, and I was like, hey, read this. He's like, okay, outside, and he came back, and he was like, outside the atrocious grammar and the misspellings, he was like, this is really good. He's like, we could do this. And I was like, okay, let's do it. So we started chipping away at Black Autumn, and we were working on it for about 3 years, but it was like the last year we started really buckling down, and Jason got really into it and we didn't know anything about writing, other than like military manuals and stuff. And he'd written a book about entrepreneurs that he never published, which is quite good. And then and he'd written a slew of blog articles. He'd written a slew of blog articles, but never like a fiction novel. And so he started deep diving like the character arcs and, the emotional issues that characters have and the transitions they have to. So you make it an interesting read with right amount of drama and stuff. And so we kept hammering this thing out, and we're like, okay, we're done. The book was like that thick. And so it was like, well, let's go to a publisher, because that's what you do when you write a book, right? Is you go to a publisher. And so went to a publisher, and they looked at it, and they're like, book's great. You need to chop out like half of what you've got in here. And we're like, no, we can't do that, because you fall in love with the characters that you're writing about. And it's like, no, we can't cut those guys out. They're important aspects of the book. And they're like, your book's too long. And so we were like, okay. So we ended up chopping a bunch of characters, and we went back and we had to chop some more stuff that came back. We came back and we had Black Autumn. So we really condensed it, allow us to do some better character development with some of the characters that are in there. And then we released it. And so we got, we were a bestseller on Amazon for about 48 hours, but hey, we were a bestseller on Amazon, and we got a ton of feedback from people that were like, man, I really like your book. When's the next one coming out? And then people started saying, hey, it would be really interesting to hear about maybe characters in the other parts of the country, or it'd be really, because we've got kind of an interesting scenario that we think causes the world to stumble. And then they were like, it'd be really interesting to see what was happening in the rest of the world. And we were like, well, we had that, but we chopped it out because of the publisher. And so we were like, well, let's just do a novella. And so we did Black Autumn Travelers. So that takes place. So Black Autumn takes place in like 17-day time frame. It's real condensed. And so Black Autumn Travelers is 3 of the characters that we'd cut out that are trying to get back to Utah. And so they're in Black Autumn Travelers, and it's just their story. And then people were like, man, it'd be really cool if, we knew what else was going on in the rest of the world. And so we were like, well, okay. So we did the last Air Force One. So the President of the United States is flying around in Air Force One, he's getting refueled in flight, as he's flying around trying to figure out how to, stop the world from falling apart and the country from falling apart. But he's getting all of this intel feeds that's in there. So it really is rich in developing the whole worldwide view of what's happening, because so many people asked us for that. And so now, and then we're getting ready to release Black Autumn Conquistadors. So I won't be the spoiler alert on that, but it has to do with the cartel and what they would do, because the cartel is a major force that we are dealing with in the U.S. as well as Central South America. And so it's like, well, what would these guys do? And so we started writing, a book about that, and that's Conquistadors, Black Autumn Conquistadors. And then the sequel, White Wasteland. So the sequel to Black Autumn is called White Wasteland. It's getting edited right now, and we'll release that probably in January.
That's really interesting. Did you really focus more on the story and the characters, or with all of the work that you do with Readyman, could you not help but put in survival tactics in the way they handle the situation?
There's definitely survival tactics. Yeah, it's definitely the bunch of survival. The whole premise of the book is to get people to think. So it's like a bunch of SF dudes and Black Ops, surprise, right? But it's a bunch of SF dudes that think that they're prepared, and then all of a sudden stuff starts falling apart because there's a million different, combinations of things that can happen that can lead to weird outcomes. And so we're maintaining this. It's called a black swan event. So the more sophisticated a society gets, the more fragile it gets, because all of a sudden you have such specificity in skills and knowledge that make the world work or make your country work, that if you lose those people, then all of a sudden the world starts tripping and you start having problems because you can't readily replace that knowledge or those skills. And it could be, and it doesn't have to be just people. People are the glaring example, but it could be, it could be tools. Like, so some of the stuff that we have on our electrical grid, if it breaks today, they'll just reroute the power around it. But if a part breaks today, it's 2 weeks because they don't keep stocks of parts on hand. They've got to call somebody that makes that thing, and then they make it, and then they bring it out, and then they reinstall it so they can. But we don't notice that in today's society because they just reroute the grid and it just goes around that, and then they fix it and then they reroute it back, and away you go. But if everything collapsed, then all of a sudden there's nowhere to reroute. And so so the premise of the book was a whole bunch of little things happen that tie together in kind of weird ways that then cause the world to stumble. And actually, if we look through history, so we started looking, because I'm a student of history, and when I started looking at history, and it's like we have these black swan events that happen about every 50 years or so. Sometimes we hear about them, sometimes we don't, but it's instances of like a whole bunch of little things that by themselves really aren't that big of a deal, but they all weave together into like this rope that ends up starting to drag society down. So like the collapse in 2009, 2008, nobody could have, well, there were a few people that kind of predicted it, but nobody could have predicted how bad it really was. You could argue the Great Depression was a black swan event, and the American Civil War was a black swan event, and World War I was a black swan event, where it was just little things happened that caused all of a sudden these travesties. If Archduke Ferdinand had not been assassinated, and it was like there were multiple assassination attempts that they had tried and they had failed because guys didn't know what they were doing, it wouldn't have kicked off World War I. But it wasn't only that. The Allies were already on edge, and actually everybody had sent out letters that said, okay, we're not going to attack, it's fine, everybody go home. And then somebody started shooting, and it was like, okay, I guess we're going to war, and they attacked. And so like Tecumseh, the Shawnee war chief, almost pushed the settlers off the continent, but for a whole bunch of little instances that happened that combined together, it didn't happen. You're talking about instances that turn the course of history, and so that's what we try to capture in Black Autumn, and also with these soft guys, that it's like there's a whole bunch of little things that keep happening where it's like, man, I hadn't prepared for that. And I most certainly hadn't prepared for those three things happening all at once. So
I'm really glad we're talking about this now, partially because it was a little bit of a project for me that I was on a joint initiative team for Army and Air and the Utah Guard. My team, we saw that there was a big lack in that. We're the ones that are supposed to be ready if there's a state disaster, and we're the ones that need to step up, but we're not necessarily supported to make sure that we're ready at home so that we could leave to support the state. And so I started working with Utah's state disaster management to create a program to start maybe make a dent in that, to start supporting. But it's definitely something I'm passionate about, but I'm more curious about why you've chosen it to be such a big pivotal part of your career.
Well, because I think preparedness, emergency preparedness is like this huge broad brushstroke thing, right? I mean, if we look at it, so like when we teach like home defense and tactics, which is essentially like close quarter battle, we're always preaching, seek the probability of threat. What's the probability of threat? Jeff, do I go left or right here? What's your probability of threat? Jeff, what's the correct answer here? What was your probability of threat? So if we look at the probability of threat and what that means in our lives, and I'll get to where that's super important for a big joint effort with like what you're doing, is our probability of threat as individuals is, cancer, heart disease, car wreck are probably the three biggies that are going to affect our lives. Now, they're going to affect all of us in a different way. But for some folks, you're talking extreme financial hardship that they're then going to go into. And so, are you financially prepared? And there's a number of different ways to do that. Are you living within your means and all of that stuff? But then also, are you buying more than just 1 or 2 days worth of food? Are you buying food because if you buy food in bulk, it costs less, it takes a little bit of room, you have to store it. But then if mom or dad loses their job or gets sick or a car accident, you've got some type of basis, some type of, of fudge that you can then go, okay, we're not going to be able to buy groceries this week, but next week will be okay, or for the next 2 weeks, but then we'll be okay because that's given us enough time that we can then go out and find a job or figure out something else. Or for the insurance payment, I had one of my guys that just recently got hit in a car crash. And he's been a month and he's waiting for the insurance to, and if he had been out of work, he's not working and he's not bringing in, like who's going to put food on the table. So with that, it's like this individual preparedness is so incredibly important, because when we start talking about joint preparedness, everybody thinks like, FEMA or the government is going to come in and help us. Something happens, the floods in Mississippi or Katrina, which is probably one of the more extreme examples, the federal government's going to come in and help us. Well, yeah, maybe eventually. What they don't hear is like the Mormon church stepped in and is pretty much what bailed FEMA out during Katrina, because they were the only ones that had any food that was stored up with food and water and blankets and all of that stuff. And then the other thing that happens too is the law enforcement or emergency workers, what do you think is going to happen? Are they going to take care of their family, or are they going to show up to work?
Right. Their family.
They're going to take care of their family.
Right.
Because it's, and even if they don't take care of their family, so somebody that doesn't take care of their family, you got to kind of question them anyways, where it's like, how come you're not taking care of your family? You're a little weird. But then also, somebody that still shows up to work, even though that their family is maybe having a hard time, how much of their brain power is actually at work at their job at hand? Way less. And so any emergency preparedness plan, like what you're talking about, starts with the individual. You make sure that individual has got the baseline of whatever they need, whatever that is, 72 hours or 72 weeks. Pick your poison, but they are ready so that they will show up to work. Because if there's no food in the pantry and mom or dad's not going to work, they're gonna try and figure out some way of getting, because they're not going to leave their kids at home without food. They're going to go out and find something, especially if the power's gone out because there's been a massive earthquake or something like that. And so I think emergency preparedness starts with the individual. And so for me, having been in special forces, we lived that life constantly, because we would go to austere environments and we would live with the locals, and we were constantly, it was like, okay, we need a supply of food, we need a supply of batteries, we need a supply of substance and gas and all of this stuff, because if we get attacked or all of a sudden we lose our ability, or we're not getting resupplied, from the big green machine because of weather or whatever happens, we can subsist without that for X amount of time. And I think as citizens, regular citizens, we're no different. We should be able to be prepared in case something happens so that we can either lend a hand to somebody else while simultaneously taking care of our own family.
There's a lot of people that are very casual about it or think that it's not that big of a deal because in my life, how often have I needed emergency water? Like, how do you respond to people like that?
Well, I mean, I go, well, do you buy insurance?
Yeah.
Do you have car insurance?
Sure.
When's the last time you got in a car wreck?
I mean, I've never caused a car wreck.
But you still have car insurance. Why do you have car insurance?
I have to, though.
But you have to.
Yeah.
So you're spending, and that's why on this, when we wrote this, a beginner's emergency survival preparedness, 10 easy steps for less than fire insurance. That's like how many homes burn down every year? Well, unless you're in California and you're next to these raging wildfires. But how many homes, realistically, like how many homes? There's a few. Yeah. But is it so many that we have to have fire insurance? But you can't get a home loan unless you have fire insurance. The bank's like, no, you're getting fire insurance because your home could burn down and we want the insurance company to pay for this. So you still pay for it. You still pay for car insurance and health insurance and fire insurance and flood insurance. So why not, for less than, I think we figured it out, we've got it down to like $100 a month or something, where you can just chip. You don't have to do it all at once. You just start chipping away at it and saying, okay, I'm prepared here. I'm prepared here. For me personally, that's where I've gone through my life and I've said, what bills can I remove? And then I start chipping away at those bills. So we got a solar system for my house that, we're making payments on that, but we're pretty quick to paying that off. But it's like, well, if you talk to the traditional financial people, they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense because it's going to take you 12 years to pay that thing off. And it's like, well, yeah, it is, except that I can pay it off now. And then in case something happens to me in the future, or me or my wife, I'm not stuck with that power bill. I've got some means of reducing that down, and that may be whatever that is for folks. Maybe that's a car. Do you know what I mean? Don't buy the new car, buy the used car. It's about half the price, and all of a sudden your bill is paid off way faster than versus having and so then all of a sudden if there's problems in your life, that's one less thing. When you have financial hardship, $100 is a lot of money.
Yes.
I mean, it's a lot of money. And so now all of a sudden, if you can remove $100 bill, whatever your car payment is, that's a big deal in case you lose your job or mom and dad have issues or, get sick or something like that.
It's really what I hear you saying is that it's just making smart decisions so that you're that better off when whatever black swan events happen that are maybe smaller condensed to your life, so that you don't have any room to be victimized by what happened. It's just, I've planned for that.
Well, and emergency preparedness too is long-term thinking. I mean, as Americans, we're really bad for, thinking past the end of our nose when the reality is we should be thinking long-term, right? Like I've already got bank accounts for my boys that's going to be their school bank accounts, and it's like, how $50 a month or something. But if you amortize that out and you're like $50 a month, that's nothing in the scheme of things. Yeah, but I'm going to put $50 a month in there for 18 years. Now, all of a sudden, you're talking a serious chunk of change by the time those guys get to be 18 years old. And for me, the impact, $50 a month isn't that big of an impact for me, but it'll be a huge impact for them further down the road. Everybody's talking about retirement and 401ks and IRAs and all that stuff. Yeah, they're very important. And that's that long-term thinking. And that's where I look at emergency preparedness causes you to think long-term. It's a bit of a different mindset. And unless you put yourself into that mindset, it's really hard to maintain it. It's really easy to live in the here and now with the social media and, scrolling through super fast and learning new things and seeing videos that are like 60 seconds long and moving on to the next thing versus saying, hey, I need to think about 1 year from now, 5 years from now. For me, I'm thinking 20 years from now for when my boys are, when they're men and they're going to college and they're buying their own homes and getting married or, and having their own families.
It sounds like, too, with what you were saying earlier, that being a Green Beret and the way that you learned to think because of that career, that Readyman and being prepared like that was a very natural transition.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah.
It was just almost like taking it to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there other habits or skill sets that you took with you from the military that you still use, maybe with business?
I think exercise is one of them, and I'm guilty as anybody else, where it's like you go whole hog, and then you go, ooh, all right, I got to get back, and I got to clean up my diet, and I've got to get out and start, running again, or rowing or biking or whatever, pick your poison is. And so I think exercise, because it's such an integral part of the military, it really ingrains it into you to where it's part of your culture. I mean, you saw our gym that we have down here. And it's like, sometimes that gym will go weeks and not get used, but the fact that it's there, it's very much a part of the culture of the mill, because everybody is always exercising, because it's it's so much a part of the military, because that's part of your promotion points, is how well you do on the physical fitness test.
Right.
And so, it's like you score 300 on the PT test, then you get more promotion points. So it's very much a part. So I'd say that's one, because it's also, I found too, when I start getting stressed out and things aren't working or whatever on business, exercise is one of those ways. It's like that whole decompression that we had talked about before, where it's like, okay, I can relieve a lot of the emotional and psychological strain that I'm going through by going out and exercising, running, or yoga, or it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you're getting your butt off the couch and doing something.
Right. What stories do you like to tell from your military career?
I think probably, a good story, probably the story I tell the most, probably because people ask me this the most, is, so I'm the inventor of the RATS tourniquet, the Rapid Application Tourniquet. And people ask me, they're like, how did you come up with this thing? And so for me, that's probably the one that I tell the most, but I also tie that in. I go around and I speak about leadership and whatnot from time to time. And the tourniquet story kind of exemplifies the process of good leadership, because you won't have creative people unless you have good leadership. And so for me, that's kind of a litmus test with my folks that are here, is if they're being creative, then it's like, okay, I'm doing the right thing on the leadership side. But when the creativity starts slowing down or stops, it's like, okay, what am I doing wrong that's causing them? Because creative thinking is a very high brain instance that happens. So just little bits of stress will start shutting down the creative brain, and we start going more, we're constantly, it's this game between, the frontal lobe and the reptilian brain. And we're constantly flowing back and forth based off of what we're experiencing in life and where we're at and what we're doing. And it's only the times that we get where we have the creativity, that we're coming up with new stuff, is when the stress is somewhat low. There's a need, but the higher brain can sit there and analyze and figure out solutions to those stuff. And so for me, we were moving up on a target one night. This was like 2007, I think. And I was in Afghanistan, and so it was me and a couple of other Americans, and we had about 100 of our Afghan commandos that were with us, and we were moving up to this target. It's night. It was probably 1 o'clock in the morning or something, and so we're wearing NVGs and stuff. And so we're moving up to this target, and in Afghanistan, they've got walls around all of the compounds, and they're like 12 to 14 feet tall. And so we'd put ladders up on these walls, send guys up on the ladders, so then they could cover the assault team as they'd go through the gate. So we'd use a charge, an explosive. We'd knock the gate down, and then we'd go into the compound and start clearing the compound with these guys up on the wall as Overwatch. So anyways, we're moving up to the target. We're getting set. 2 of my guys are putting the charge on the door. We get compromised, and the guys aren't up the ladders yet. And so we get compromised, and the intel had told us that there was between 1 and 5 Al-Qaeda guys inside of this compound. Well, one of the Al-Qaeda guys runs out into the middle. Something tipped him off. Runs out into the courtyard of this compound and starts blazing with his AK through the gate. So hits my guys in the legs, the breachers that are up there, hits them in the legs, and the fight's on, right? And so we run up there, grab these guys, drag them down into a ditch so that the medics can start working on them. And we had indig medics. And so at one point, I'm sitting here advising and helping direct the fight that's going on at the time. And I look down at my medics to see how these guys are doing. And I look down in the medics, so it's high stress. We're in the middle of a gunfight. We're wearing NVGs. We're working in the dark. And the tourniquet we had at the time was black. And so we're working with a black tourniquet. We're wearing black gloves. We're wearing camouflage uniforms, so they're dark in color. And I look down, and my medics are having a hard time with this. They're fumbling with this tourniquet. And so I looked at that, and it was like that snapshot moment where it was like, that's interesting. And then I was back into the fight. And then later on, those same guys that had been hitting the legs were calling medevac in. And the traditional tourniquet has a stick that spins around and makes things tighter, and sometimes it'll pull clothing, which then pulls skin up into the windlass. That stick's called the windlass, and so these guys were, their skin had gotten pulled up into the windlass, and they're trying to pull the tourniquets off. Yeah, super painful. They had nasty bruises when they came back, and so they're trying to pull these tourniquets off. Without, but we had to leave them in place because that's what was keeping them from bleeding out, right? And so that was another one of those And so fast forward, so I'd go over to Afghanistan, and then I'd come back, and then I'd go over and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth, for like 12 years. And so when I came back, I was teaching a bunch of Air Force pararescuemen, some PJs, and we were running them through a very stressful course where we'd shoot thousands of rounds of simunitions, and simunitions are painful. So we're inducing pain on these guys, and we're working in the dark, under stress, with NVGs, and we're inducing casualties. And we're saying, you're hitting the arm, put a tourniquet on that arm. You're hitting the leg, put a tourniquet on that leg. And so I'm standing on the catwalk, they're in the shoot house, and I'm standing up on the catwalk looking down, and I'm like, those PJs are fumbling the same way that my Afghan medics were fumbling. And it was that moment where I was like, well, this isn't a training issue. This is a design issue. And so from there, I was like, well, there's got to be something else that's out here, And so I started looking for other tourniquets. Tourniquets were brand new at that time. Like up until about 2003, 2004, they told you not to use tourniquets. They were like, tourniquets were only last resort, and all of these wives' tales about like you're going to lose the limb and nerve damage and all this other crap that they used to preach, that was the God-honest gospel truth coming from medical people. Completely wrong. And so it took the military about 2 weeks to figure out, it's like, you guys have got to start using tourniquets, because men and women were still expiring. They were making it all the way back to Landstuhl, Germany, and still dying because they were going into liver failure, because it was a type of hypovolemic shock of bleeding death. It was just taking longer because the toxins had built up because they didn't have enough volume to move the blood. And so anyways, they were like, you've got to start using tourniquets. Then they started using tourniquets. So I'm looking for something different than what we were being issued, something better. Couldn't find it. And so I was like, well, I'm going to see if I can come up with something better. And then so 26 prototypes later, and 2 years, the RATS tourniquet was born. So it was, super, and we proved it out, super simple to use under like the highest level of stress. And like the little metal part is a boat cleat. So very simple. It's been in use for like 2,000 years or something. And essentially that was it. And so that's, probably the most prominent story that I tell from the military time, but it also exemplifies where, like the unit that I was in, we were constantly trying to find solutions to problems, because a lot of the stuff we were doing was unproven. close quarter battle is actually very new in training in U.S. military. And, outside of like Delta Force or SEAL Teams, nobody was really doing close quarter battle. And then all of a sudden the war kicked off and it was like, holy cow, we're fighting in cities. We got to start teaching people CQB. Well, the tactics that we started off with in the beginning days are not the tactics that we use now, today. They evolved because we got smarter. And so equipment and mindset has changed too. Like in the 90s, when I was doing a lot of martial arts and I was still amateurly fighting, I couldn't drag guys over to martial arts classes. But then the war kicked off and it was like, now there's a military martial arts program. And it's like, of course we do martial arts. But it wasn't that way in the 90s, And so we've evolved and we've changed, just like the tourniquets, In the 90s, it was like, don't use tourniquets. Well, now it's like, use tourniquets. As a matter of fact, tourniquets are the most reliable, safest means of stopping the number one preventable cause of death on the battlefield, which is bleeding to death.
It's a great story. It's, not everybody also takes the time to really realize that that's a flaw in the way that it's created.
Yeah.
I think that's really important too, to look at it from a leadership perspective and see that sometimes when people are struggling, it's not because they're not doing it right. It's because sometimes there's a system or something that needs to change to support your people better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that was with me. There's a fundamental with close quarter battle, but then everybody kind of tweaks it left and right a little bit based off of the strengths and weaknesses of their personnel and their leadership. And so every time that I would come in, because we'd rotate through, and every time that we'd come in and we'd start talking about CQB, I would watch my indige go through the house, and different teams would do it just a little bit different. And I never would step in and say, no, you've got to do it this way. It was like if they weren't violating security and they were safe and effective doing it, I didn't change it. It was a little bit different than I would have done it, but it's easier for me to adopt than it is for this team to change the way that they're doing stuff. And so, and it's the same thing, I think, as Americans. We get so caught up in our paradigms of what we think is right. And part of that is kind of like propaganda. You've got to think that way so that you have confidence in your men, weapons, and equipment, right? But then it's also, I think, in some ways is a little bit flawed because it keeps us from looking for new things or changing, tactics and techniques or whatever it is that we're doing. And so that's where, you really... And again, that's where it's like if you have good leadership and you've got that creativity flowing where there's trust in the leadership as well as trust in the people, then you come up with those creative, ingenious solutions to problems.
Perfect. Such a great point. Just two more questions. The last two questions. If you could give the new enlistees a superpower that would help them with their whole career and the future of the military, what would it be?
Work ethic. Work ethic. Work ethic. War is work, plain and simple. It's mind-numbing, repetitive work, and you don't get good at something just doing it once. You get good at doing something 10,000 times. The whole thing about, I don't know if it's true or not, but you do something 10,000 times to master it. Well, that's a lot of mind-numbing, repetitive work so that you can get good at it. And if you look at a modern soldier today, that it's a professional soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, that's a professional today, we have unbelievably complex jobs. And I would argue that infantry type jobs are the most complex jobs that are out there. And if you're not constantly working, and it takes work ethic to get better, you've got to buckle down and read that boring, training manual. You've got to buckle down and train with the latest and greatest. You've got to buckle down and you've got to teach it to other people so that they understand it and ask you smart questions to make you think about it. And so I would say first and foremost, work ethic is the single most important thing. And then that goes back to our original discussion of do what you want to do and then have the work ethic to get really good at it. And so for me, I love studying different languages. I've studied 7 different foreign languages. I don't speak any, but I've studied 7 different foreign languages, and I would read training manuals, and I wrote my own manuals, and I would get up and I would teach, and I shot every gun I could get my hands on, and got good at shooting every gun I could get my hands on, because that was my job, and I'd dig in and I'd study because I enjoyed it. So it starts with do what you want to do, and then have the work ethic to get really good at it.
Last question is, how do you respond when people thank you for your service?
That's always tricky for me, because I'm kind of embarrassed, because, when people thank me for my service, I'm kind of like, oh, thanks. But it was what I always wanted to do. Yeah, there's God and country and family wrapped up into that, but I did what I did in the military because I loved it. I loved the job. I loved who I was surrounded by. I had a fantastic time. Like, the best people that in the world are people that I was surrounded and had the opportunity of working with. I mean, I was standing on the shoulders of giants when I was doing that. It wasn't because I was a great person. It was because I was surrounded by great people. And so, but then I also say, hey, thank you for your service, because without the people at home, keeping the lights on, essentially, like, none of the military wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be anything to do. There wouldn't be anything to defend if it wasn't for the folks back home, if it wasn't for the police officers, if it wasn't for the ambulance, if it wasn't for the doctors and the electrician and the linemen and all of those guys keeping the machine moving. Those folks, and the entrepreneurs too, that are putting new products out and creating jobs and all of that stuff. They're doing service too for the country, a vital service for the country, and all of that meshes together to work in unison.
And I guess the only last question I would possibly have is, if there's anybody that wants to follow you or who hasn't actually followed Readyman, because they should have already heard of it if you ask me, but how do they find you?
Just readyman.com. So, and then we're Readyman Media on Facebook, and then we're Readyman Network on Instagram, and then we also have just a Readyman page on Instagram there too. And then, so those are the biggies. We do live shows once or twice a week. We get in, we do hour-long shows where we interview people or talk about different subjects. We take questions from people. We can see their questions when they come up on the video monitor and all of that stuff. So they can find us that way is the best way.
Awesome. Well, Jeff Kirkham, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. You have so much rich experience with the military and so many great perspectives. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and found a new mindset to help you excel. For more information or to comment on what you learned, please visit www.tamfpodcast.com/Readyman.